Thanks, Steve. This is an exciting series for me because I am really into the book of Kings. Most of my stuff I do as a professor is all on the historical books. So we're continuing this series on Who is Your King? And so I'm going to look at the story of Solomon today, the ambiguous story of King Solomon. So to start off, I want to read a passage. So if you don't have a Bible, if you put up your hand, the connecting team will bring you a Bible. Either that or open up an app or Google it. We're going to start with 1 Kings 11, 4 to 10. 1 Kings 11, 4 to 10. Last week, Steve started off with the beginning of the book of Kings. And you might be like, why are we jumping like 9 chapters? Well, we're going to read the end and then go back and look at the story. So 1 Kings 11, 4 to 10. And it says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David, his father, had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart is turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So, if you read the first 10 chapters of Kings, it seems like everything's going pretty good for Solomon. And this is, maybe there should have been a spoiler alert before we read this passage, because this spoils the end. It kind of seems to come out of nowhere, like, what? How did this happen? It's a huge spoiler. Pastor Steve last week talked about the beginning of the book and how Solomon kind of becomes king, mostly focusing on David. But if at that point, you probably wouldn't have seen this coming. David says, obey the law, you're going to be all right. Well, it reminds me of the movie The Sixth Sense. A few months ago, we showed our kids this movie, and it came out 25 years ago. Anyone seen the movie? If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil it. Okay? There's got to be a statute of limitation in that, right? It's a quarter century old. Is that okay? Don't be like, we were going to watch it tonight. This sucks. Anyway, if you haven't seen it, he's dead the whole time. You don't know that till the end. But it's a pretty big part of it. But for those of us who've seen it, we know that at the end when we find out, it's like the biggest surprise in our life. It's like, what? No way. We just thought his wife was mad at him for a whole year and wouldn't talk to him, but he actually was dead, So when you rewatch it, though, it's pretty obvious, because at the very beginning, some guy pulls out a gun, shoots him, blood everywhere, it looks like he's dying, and then we watch the movie for 2 hours and we think, no, he can't be dead. It's just, his wife's mad at him. It's even when you get shot, it's your fault. That's how marriage works. But actually, my wife's not in this service. So I think it's kind of similar to Solomon's story, though, because when I rewatched this movie with my kids, the whole time I was like, oh, it's so obvious the kids are going to guess what happened, that he's dead. But they didn't pick up on it at all. But when I rewatched it, of course, I know the end, and it seems like, oh, this is so obvious. So kind of like in Solomon's story, if you know the end, how eventually he does this bad stuff, follows other gods, and then you go back and you read the story of Solomon, I think it kind of forecasts a bit of the end. It's kind of a spoiler. So I want to look at the whole story of Solomon today in less than 30 minutes, I hope. And so buckle up. This is a lot of chapters of the Bible. I encourage you to go read them. Read 1 Kings 1 to 11. So last week at the beginning of his reign, Steve had pointed out that his father David got him to kind of whack a couple of his people he wanted to kill but couldn't kill in his own time, like Joab and Shimei. He even liquidates his brother Adonijah, who made a play for the throne. But I want to pick up the story in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we're told that Solomon marries the Pharaoh's daughter. Weddings are always nice, right? Isn't that beautiful? Well, there's a lot of debate about this marriage. Some think this was a sinful move on Solomon's part, to marry the Pharaoh's daughter. Well, why would that be bad? Well, in the Old Testament, the people of God, the nation of Israel, was not supposed to make alliances with other nations. The reason is they were supposed to rely just on God for their security. You know how they win all their battles when God wins the battles for them, right? And they're not supposed to rely on Egypt. And here, he's making a marriage alliance with Egypt. Not only that, the Pharaoh represents evil oppression. You know the story of the Exodus. They leave the Exodus to get away from the Pharaoh and the evil oppression. So now he's joined with the oppressor. It's got to be bad. Or does it? Some people think, no, there's nothing wrong with this. The Bible does list a bunch of peoples you're not supposed to intermarry with. If in Deuteronomy 7, 1-3, it says, don't marry Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, Nuphies, and these types of people. But it doesn't mention Egyptians there. So, hey, maybe it's ambiguous. Moses married a Cushite. The Cushites ruled Egypt for a couple generations. Joseph, of course, married an Egyptian, Asenath. So maybe, and not all the pharaohs are bad. In Joseph's story, the pharaoh was a pretty good guy. So maybe it's not bad. Or maybe it's a little ambiguous. Maybe reading this in light of the ending, like you already saw the spoiler alert in The Sixth Sense, you could see it. He's marrying a foreign wife. Maybe that's the problem. But it's hard to know when Solomon crosses the line in the story. I remember when I was a youth, we talked a lot about how far can I go? I don't know if the youth still talk about this today. They're just all on Instagram now. But back then, we were interested in dating other people, and we were like, can I hold a hand? Is that okay? Is kissing all right? How far when I cross into sin? Or even with other things, youth and adults might be interested in. Like, how far can we go before we cross a line into sin? Well, when we look at Solomon's story, I think we can ask this. I want us to keep this question in mind as we go through his story. Is he crossing the line? Is he approaching the line here with Pharaoh's daughter? Maybe it's like rewatching The Sixth Sense. You see it clear as day. He has a problem with foreign wives later. Interestingly, though, in the verse it says that Solomon also loved the Lord. So it says he marries the Pharaoh's daughter, but he showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of David. So Solomon's not a really evil guy here. He loves the Lord. This is actually one of the only points where someone is said to love the Lord in the story, actually. But maybe he's a little ignorant. So he does kill some people at the beginning, and then he marries the Pharaoh's daughter. But does this mean he's an evil character? Well, he might be just even lacking in wisdom. A good piece of advice I always like is when I'm trying to judge whether someone does something like, are they just being a jerk? Is called Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor. And it says, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. That's a good piece of advice. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. So Solomon here is young, naive. He's lacking wisdom, which seems pretty clear. So maybe Solomon early in these chapters isn't so much a malicious character as much as maybe a little ignorant. It's because some of what he does is ethically questionable. He's lacking in wisdom. Well, and God appears to him, famously. You probably heard this story. God appears to him at Gibeon and says, hey, ask for whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. Wow, wouldn't that be amazing? What would you ask for? When I was a kid, we always talked about, if I found a genie in a bottle, what would I ask for, And we'd usually say, well, first of all, unlimited wishes, of course. Most people thought that wasn't allowed. Or maybe superpowers or something like this. But what you would ask for tells us something about your character, I think. The story is told of a man at work. He stumbles across a lamp in his office, and he rubs the lamp, and pops a genie. Yes, it's a true story. But he dusts off the lamp. The genie's there. Genie says, okay, you get 3 wishes, but because this is your boss's lamp, your boss gets twice of whatever you ask for. He says, okay. He says, my first wish, I want $1 million. The genie says, okay, your boss gets $2 million. And for my second wish, I want a house in Hawaii. He says, okay, your boss now has 2 beautiful houses in Hawaii. He says, that's fine. My third wish is, I want you to donate one of my kidneys. Revenge. Well, what does Solomon ask for? He could have asked for something like that. But Solomon actually asks for wisdom, understanding, discernment. He wants to know good and evil and how to govern these people. He wants to know how to serve better, how to help God's people. And I think this tells us something about his character. He's not a vengeful, ambitious person at this point. He's concerned with how he could best serve God's people. But how does God respond? So it says, God says to him, because you've not asked for this, and not for long life, wealth, or asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I'm going to give you wisdom, he says, but I'll also give you what you didn't ask for, riches and honor. Well, that's pretty awesome. He got one wish and he received three. Well, God responds this way, and we got to remember that as the story goes on and Solomon collects all this wealth and he seems to have a lot of blessing, that God is giving it to him. God is giving him blessing. He's given him riches and honor, stuff he didn't ask for. We're not really sure why he does that. Why do you think God does that? Some people think it's so that he can be a good ruler. Aristotle said that the only way a king could be a wise and just ruler is if he had lots of wealth and power. He wouldn't have to worry about his own affairs. He could just justly judge people. I don't know if you buy that one. But Plato completely disagreed. Plato says the only way to have a just ruler is to keep him far away from gold. Otherwise, he'll just get greedy and obsessed with it. Well, the text doesn't say why God gives him these blessings. Some think it's a test on Solomon. I think it's easier answer is to say that God gives good gifts to his children. But Solomon is a complex character, and his story is a little complex. So last week, Steve talked about David's complexity, right? A lot of what we pick up on David is when David says stuff. Solomon's a little different. In fact, if you read chapters 4 to 11, Solomon never has a conversation with anybody face to face. He sends a letter out to somebody. He doesn't even reply when they complain about the arrangement. God appears to him in 9:9. Solomon doesn't even reply. The Queen of Sheba shows up, and she talks lots to him. He doesn't say anything. Or it could just be, women talk a lot more than men. Maybe that's what's going on in that chapter. I'm not sure. But most kings in the story talk more than Solomon does. So the only way we can judge his character here is his actions, to see what he did. So God says he's given him wisdom. And then we get this great story that happens right after this in chapter 3. Solomon's wisdom displayed. These two prostitutes both have newborns, and they live in the same house. One rolled over in the middle of the night and accidentally killed their baby. And so they swapped babies with another prostitute. So they've come before the king for a judgment. You probably know this story. It's a very famous story. And so they say, no, that's my baby. No, mine is the live baby. Hers is the dead baby. Solomon says, okay, grab a sword. We're going to cut the baby in two. And then they can just share the baby. And of course, the real mother says, no. Just give the baby to the other woman then. And then Solomon says, that's the real mother. And he gives the baby to her. And everyone's blown away like, wow, God has given him wisdom. It's amazing. And it is. That's such a cool story. But some people reading this in light of the end, the end of the story of Solomon, they go back and read it and think, there's something wrong with this picture. These are two prostitutes. Solomon doesn't judge that problem. Prostitution is said to be an abomination to the Lord in the law. Is he really delivering justice if he doesn't even address that issue? Is he turning a blind eye to oppression and to sexual sin? Sins that he'll get in trouble with later on. Well, moving on, chapter 4, we learn a lot about his kingdom. He has this amazing, effective government, you could say. Or is it oppressive? Again, we have to think, where is he crossing a line? But it's so well organized, it's a spectacular kingdom. Probably you're supposed to be impressed. It lists all these people involved, all the great building projects he's doing. But is there some ambiguity here? Later, after Solomon passes away and his son takes the throne, the people come to him in chapter 12 and say, your father put a heavy yoke on us. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we'll serve you. Is this hinting that there was problems earlier in Solomon's reign where he actually took advantage of his people rather than help them? When did he cross this line from, appropriate state labor and infrastructure being implemented to oppression for his own gain? It's hard to know where Solomon crosses the line. Although 1 Kings 4 says, at least at this point, things are going pretty good for Israel. 1 Kings 4, 20-21 says, the people of Judah and Israel were numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. So that sounds like a pretty good situation, right? Solomon seems like a pretty good king. And not only that, they rule over all the kingdoms of the river, that's the Euphrates, to the border of Egypt. So this is actually the breadth of the promised land. These are the biggest boundaries that the Israelites ever had. And it goes back to Genesis 15. God promises this to Abraham. Genesis 15:18, he said, to your descendants I give this land, from the river in Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. So finally under Solomon, they get all the promised land. So that's got to be a good thing, right? Well, right after this, we hear how much Solomon eats. This one's kind of amazing. Solomon's daily provisions are listed. 150 bushels or 30 cores of flour. That's a lot of pancakes. 60 cores, 300 bushels of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, goats, gazelles, lots of meat. Lots and lots of meat, which is a luxury in the ancient world. I always think it's funny when you see paintings of Solomon or pictures, he's always kind of slim and trim. But maybe he was a little more minivan than sports car, you know what I mean? Maybe he should look more like Henry VIII, I'm not sure. But that's a lot of food for a day. And there's a contrast here with what it was like for the Israelites. I think I have another slide. During Solomon's lifetime, it says, Judah and Israel lived securely, each man under his own vine and fig tree. Sounds pretty positive. Although Solomon's got boatloads of food and they just got a vegetarian diet. That's terrible. No, it could be ambiguous. Is there a purposeful contrast here the author's making? I mean, on one hand, they're living in safety, but compared to Solomon, is Solomon's food a sign of blessing or has it become self-indulgence? Not sure. There's some ambiguity. When does he cross the line where his banquets maybe become inappropriate? How about the temple? Solomon's temple. Solomon's probably most famous for his wisdom and building the temple. Solomon's temple, is this just to show off his wealth? Some people have said that, so you can be the judge of this. Some people think it's what sociologists call conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is the spending of money and resources in ostentatious ways because you want to look rich. Does Solomon just lavish the temple with all these precious metals because he wants to look good and powerful? Well, maybe, but maybe actually people who think the temple's a waste of money. Some actually say the temple drained Israel's wealth and provided only a temporary appearance of strength and grandeur. But maybe they're missing the importance of the temple as to point to God. So you can be the judge here, but the temple, the money and resources poured into the temple to make it beautiful is to point to the beauty of Israel's God. Psalm 84, the psalmist says, how lovely is your dwelling place. My soul longs, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. The temple, it needed to be beautiful to reflect Israel's God's beauty. It reminds me of that story in the New Testament, you know, where this woman comes in and Jesus is there and she pours this expensive perfume on him. Do you remember that story? The disciples didn't like it and they say, why this waste? This is a waste. We could have sold that perfume and given the money to the poor. Jesus doesn't actually take their side on that. He says, she's done a beautiful thing, he said. And wherever the gospel is preached, this story is going to be told. The value of Israel's God was worth all that effort and all that gold and all that work to put into it. Maybe it's kind of similar there. But how long did he take to build the temple? It says it took 7 years to build the temple. That's a long time. But he took 13 years to build his own crib. His palace. Right? Is there a contrast here? Is the author saying, Solomon, maybe this is an inappropriate priorities here. He's emphasizing his own temple over God's house. Could be. I've done a lot of renovations in my house. My house is kind of old, built in 59, and we've fixed up a lot of stuff. Some renovations, I like to say sometimes that the renovations I have left would take about 10 years and 2 minutes to fix. Because some of them are just little things I never get around to that I could fix in 2 minutes. And so how fast you get something done is about how you prioritize things. Could it be that Solomon prioritized the temple, got it done in 7 years? and then just took his time on the other one because it wasn't as important? It's hard to say. We got ambiguity again. Well, we're almost at the end of the story, but before we get there, we'll look at the Queen of Sheba, which I already mentioned. The Queen of Sheba shows up, and she's kind of an eyewitness to how things are in Solomon's day. And it says that it really took her breath away when she saw his kingdom. She says, everyone's happy, servants and your men are happy, and God has installed you to do justice and righteousness. Seems like a pretty positive comment. Some people, though, read this in light of the end. You know, where those people complain that your father oppressed us. And they're thinking, well, maybe this is an ironic comment. Maybe right here, actually, things aren't as good as it looks. Maybe there's some rot below the surface. Kind of looks like a straightforward comment, but is the author maybe ironically leaving that in there? There's an interesting comment in verse 13. 10:13 says, King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired. What does that mean? All she desired. Well, it's ambiguous, okay? But some people read into that a sexual relationship. And this might seem far-fetched. Maybe it is. But there's actually traditions in Ethiopia where they claim descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And they're called the Black Jews today. So some people at least thought, maybe in light of his later sexual relationship with so many women, that when they read this, like, oh, they probably had that. Seems unlikely to me, but it's in there. How about gold? Gold. Move on to chapter 10. The weight of the gold Solomon received was 666 talents. Isn't that the number of the beast? 60. Well, I don't think that's what the author's getting at, but that's a lot of gold. 20,000 kilograms. Man, he had a lot of gold. And it goes on about everything is gold in Solomon's day. Silver's kind of worthless. There's so much gold. Well, why is this a problem? God said he was going to bring him wealth, right? Well, there's this little law in Deuteronomy 17 called the law of the king by a lot of people. And it says, the king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get horses. And he must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. And he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. So maybe there's a little ambiguity here. What's a large amount? What's a large amount? It seems pretty clear Solomon's got a large amount of gold. Tons and tons, literally, of gold. So Solomon here seems to have crossed the line on into sinful behavior because he's breaking this law explicitly. And it's worth thinking about that in our own life. The wealth was a blessing of God. But at what point did it become an idol in his life? We have blessings God gives us that he gives us because he loves us. But depending how we react to them, they can become an idol in our life. How do we cross the line from trusting God and maybe trusting money for our future? Solomon had a lot of horsepower as well. Horsepower. In the next verse it says, Solomon gathered chariots and horses, 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horses. Not only that, he got his horses from Egypt. Ooh, this seems right out of the law of the king. We can go to the next slide. That law of the king said, don't have lots of horses and don't get them from Egypt. Well, it says don't return to Egypt to get them. It's not clear whether he's sending the people to get them. Maybe the horses are just coming to him. So, but it's a little ambiguous, maybe, but it seems like he's crossed the line into getting lots of horses. Now, why would God not want the king to have horses? It's more of a dog person? No. The horses represent the military, basically. So this is amassing a military complex. And God wants his people to trust in him, not the military. So that's kind of the reason here. There's a famous psalm that says, some trust in chariots and horses, in Psalm 20, verse 7. Some trust in chariots and horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. But how about Solomon's wives? One more thing in chapter 11. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he loved many foreign women. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These were the people that God has said not to intermarry with, or they'll turn your heart astray. How many did he have? 700 wives, 300 concubines. So you might look at that law and say, well, how many is many? Seems pretty clear this is many. Okay, it's many. And so sadly, at the beginning, Solomon loved the Lord, it said, and now it says he loved foreign women. So Solomon ultimately gave in to what you could call the unholy trinity, classic sins that still dominate today: money, power, and sex. Gold is money, horses are the power, and wives and concubines galore. So earlier I asked, how far can we go? How far can we go before we kind of cross the line into sin? In Solomon's story, there's some ambiguity, but eventually he got there for sure. But where was that line in his story? There's ambiguity. Maybe rather than ask how far we can go, we need to stay as far away from that line as we can. Look at Solomon. If Solomon, one of the wisest people ever, can get taken in, so can we. God gives us good things that can be used wisely in our lives. He gives us blessings. It can remind us of his love, allow us to help other people, but they can become an end in themselves too. And something like that happened in Solomon's life. We should always reflect and think about how that could happen on our own. So how did Solomon blow it so badly? Well, look at 1 Kings 2:3. He forgot what David told him. David told him, observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in obedience, keep his decrees and commands, and he didn't do it. That law of the king was pretty clear, and he ended up violating all of those laws. Clearly, he didn't listen to God's word. So this series is called, Who's Your King? Or you could say, who's on the throne of your life? Or maybe, what is on the throne of your life? The story of Solomon, I think, stands as a warning for the subtlety of idolatry. Things that are good in our life can turn into idols. In the New Testament, Jesus warns people about not being able to serve God and money. You might remember the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6. He actually references Solomon. In verse 28-29, he says, why do you worry about your clothes? The lilies of the valley grow. They don't labor or spin. Yet not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. So Jesus brings up Solomon just to say, hey, for all his splendor, you shouldn't be trusting in riches. Look what happened to him. This lily is better than him. So he brings up Solomon to compare him and say he's inferior. Jesus says, don't serve God and money. Look at Solomon. He also mentions Solomon one other time in Matthew 12, and he recalls the Queen of Sheba, and he says, the Queen of the South is going to rise in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. But now somebody greater than Solomon is here. So just like the last reference, he references Solomon to say he's inferior. And who's he inferior to? The one greater than Solomon is Jesus himself. Even though Solomon's reign was glorious, incomparable by human standards, the Messiah's presence is much more important and more glorious. We need to align our values. We need to have God as our king. Solomon forgot that he was reigning on behalf of God. Even the richest and wisest of kings cannot compare to the Son of God. The true king, Jesus, is one greater than Solomon himself. And he is here. He's worthy of coming from the ends of the earth to hear his wisdom. So the reference to Solomon by Jesus, I think, remind us the true king, King Jesus. And everyone who wants wisdom should turn to Jesus, God's anointed one.